name is Dr. Daniel T. Moore. I work with children, and I work with a lot of children that have learning disorders. The topic of today's discussion is learning disorders. We're going to talk about what is a learning disorder, the legal definitions of learning disorders, and a practical definition of learning disorders. We'll talk about the specific types of learning disorders and how to measure them. We will also talk about specific ways to measure cognitive abilities and show you on this tape how to screen for certain problems related to learning disorders. We'll talk about conventional ways of treating learning disorders, and we'll talk about new and innovative ways of dealing with learning disorders. By the end of this tape, hopefully you'll have an idea of how to spot or recognize learning disorders, the proper methods of testing for learning disorders, and new and effective ways to treat learning disorders. So let's start with the first topic. What is a learning disorder? A learning disorder is legally defined simply as a 15-point split between a person's intelligence quotient, or IQ, and their specific achievement in a specific area. For a reading disorder, it's going to be reading. For a mathematics disorder, it's going to be in arithmetic or math. So, a 15-point split in IQ means that the IQ is 15 points higher on a standard score than their achievement scores. For the definition of a reading disorder, you need to have a child with an IQ 15 points higher than his reading abilities. Let's take some specific cases. Normally, a standard score on IQ and achievement scores is 100. Most of the children fall somewhere around 100, from 90 to 110. Okay, that is defined as average intelligence. Some children have scores of 70. 70 and below, we start looking at children that may be mentally retarded. To be labeled mentally retarded, you have to have an IQ score of 70 or below and an adaptive functioning score of 70 or below. Many children have an IQ score of 70 or below but do not have an adaptive functioning scale score of 70 or below. So they cannot be labeled mentally retarded. But we're looking at specific learning disorders. So a child to have a reading disorder can have an IQ of 100 and have a achievement score of 85 or lower, and have the legal definition of a learning disorder. A legal definition of a learning disorder qualifies a child to receive special services in school. Now let's talk a little bit about a practical definition of a learning disorder. According to the legal definition of a learning disorder, a child with an IQ of 130 can be defined having a learning disorder at 115. Reading score. Well, a reading score of 115, the child reads better than most children in school, but yet they would qualify for services for a reading disorder. That doesn't make too much sense, and it's a waste of resources to spend that type of services on a child that has an achievement score of 115. Well, what about the child that doesn't make the 15-point spread? Suppose the child had an IQ of, say, 90, but a reading achievement score of 75, or 76, or 77. A reading score of 77 or 76 is going to severely hamper that child's ability to read and comprehend what they read. So, but they don't qualify for special services because of their legal definition. Well, obviously, we need a practical definition that would help a child with an achievement score of 77 and an IQ score that has an IQ score of 85. So the practical definition looks at children that are struggling in school that may not have the legal definition but could benefit from special services. But again, to qualify for services in the schools, you need to have the legal definition. So when we talk about ways of detecting specific learning disorders and the specific abilities, we're going to assume, number one, that the child meets the legal definition of learning disorders. So when we talk about some screening tests, just automatically assume that the child has some difficulty in reading or math or writing. Okay, the specific types of learning disorder are simply a reading disorder, speech disorders, mathematics disorders, and writing disorders. Some like to include spelling disorders. In this tape we will not cover speech disorders, even though speech disorders are your most common type of learning disorder. Most schools have a good speech program to help children who do not pronounce their words very good to learn how to do that. We're going to focus on reading disorders, math disorders, and some writing disorders, and how to spot them, and how to know if a child has a specific learning disorder or not. So how do they find if a person has a reading disorder or not? Simply they give an IQ test. The IQ test or intelligence tests that are most common include the Wechsler intelligence scales, the Kaufman intelligence scales, and there are a few other types of intelligence tests, but they're not used very often. Some use a Slauson, but the Slauson is such a brief measure that it's not very practical to use when you're trying to find a legal definition of learning disorder. Another very common intelligence test is the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. The Stanford-Binet intelligence test is used primarily with children who have a real high IQ or a real low IQ to get an accurate number. The Wechsler scales and the Kaufman scales are good for children between the IQs of say 65 and 130, which are most of the children, and so the schools usually use the Kaufman scales or the Wechsler scales. Again, an IQ measure of 100 is normal. An IQ scale of 130 is viewed as a gifted child. Some states, like the state of Mississippi, have their gifted children defined as anyone with an IQ of over 120. But nationally, the cutoff range is 130. IQ score of 150 qualifies a child or the individual for the Mensa program. Mensa is a special group of very intelligent, very gifted people who simply have an IQ score of 150 or above. Again, mental retardation is defined at anyone with an IQ and adaptive functioning score of 70 or below. Okay. Many children are classified as learning disorders when really they may be mentally retarded. And that's a different topic, and that topic will not be covered in this video, although mentally retarded people can benefit from some of the activities that will be discussed in this video. Achievement scores are generally measured by an achievement test. There are many achievement tests. Some are better than others. Some of the most common achievement tests are the Kaufman achievement test. Wechsler now has some achievement tests that they use that goes along with the Wechsler scales. And there's a popular test called the RAT, although the RAT is not a very good test just because it's sort of a broad measure for achievement scores, where the other measures like the Kaufman and the Wechsler scales measures other types of or specific subtypes of reading problems, and it has like 4, or it may have 2 or 3 different scales for reading. A popular achievement test for learning disorders is the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, and it's a very good method of detecting specific problems in reading, in writing, spelling, in learning science and the social sciences. So the next question is, suppose you found some child that has a legal definition of a learning disorder, reading problem. Well, what do you do with that child? How do you treat that child? Well, that's a good question. The traditional method of treating learning disorders is to test mastery of skills. So when a teacher teaches a subject in school, she presents a topic to all the students, and then she gives a test of mastery, to see if the children learn the concepts that were presented. Then she finds, the teacher, he or she may find out what the abilities are of that student. In achievement tests, we find out if the child is able to read, do math, do writing. Then the school re-instructs children that are having problems, that have not obtained the mastery, and they may re-instruct over and over again until the child develops mastery. This works in many cases, but in many other cases it does not work. And some children with learning disorders has years and years of remedial programs to help them in their reading, and they still do not read very well. So the traditional methods is to measure mastery and then tutor and tutor and tutor. Now they may tutor in different ways. They may have a program that looks at whole word learning, or teach a child that cannot get whole word learning in phonics, or vice versa. So they may try different methods of teaching reading, but basically they're tutoring in the subject that the child's lacking and hoping that eventually the child will learn the material and overcome learning disorder. In the United States, many children that are assigned to special education because of a learning disorder receive a life sentence. They are in special education their whole life, and they are taught reading programs over and over again, or writing programs over and over again, without much accomplishment. Again, some children do benefit from this type of service. As their brain matures, they finally have the abilities they need to be able to read, or a whole word program is useful for them, where a phonics program was not much benefit. We propose a different way of looking at learning disorders. We propose looking at specific abilities that are necessary to learn. Look at abilities that are related to reading. There's probably 30 or 40 different skills or abilities that's necessary in order for a child to learn to read. If a child is lacking in one or several of these abilities, it will affect their ability to learn to read. And you can tutor them over and over again, and until they gain those abilities, they will not be able to learn how to read. We feel this makes more sense. It's to figure out why that child has a learning disability, and then give them the skills that will help them learn to read. And then you can tutor them in traditional methods, and they will learn to read and gain in reading scores. This method is now gaining popularity and spreading throughout the United States. Example, in reading, there are many specific cognitive abilities that are necessary for that child to be able to read. Some of them are internal cognitive abilities, the way the brain processes information in order for a child to read. Other abilities relate to sensory abilities, if the eyes are able to converge on the piece of paper in order to learn to read. Let me give you an example of a common perceptual inability that affects reading. Some children, when they look at letters, they see those letters dance. They're dancing up and down on the page. Now for a child that has this type of problem, they assume that everybody sees letters dancing on a page when they go to read. They have no idea that they are different, that they see letters differently. So a lot of times they have no idea why they can't read. And it's very difficult to read if those letters are dancing on the page. That's just one of the many visual problems that are associated with reading disorders. So what we're proposing is that you find methods to identify specific cognitive ability and sensory abilities that are related or cause or connected with learning disorders. There are certain abilities that are necessary for math, certain abilities that are necessary for learning how to write or how to be able to put words together and make sense out of those words. So let's talk about specific abilities and how to look at specific abilities. What are the specific abilities? Okay, again, there's cognitive abilities. These are numerous abilities that are part of intelligence that are going inside the person's brain. Okay, then there are the sensory perception abilities. For example, there's auditory perception abilities, there's visual perception abilities, and there's kinesthetic or balance type of abilities. Some or all of which are necessary for learning well in school. If a child has a lot of abilities, of these specific abilities, they will learn to read fine. If they don't, then they will have some sort of problems in their learning. Now, most people are not blessed with all the abilities. Most people have some sort of ability that affects their learning. But enough people can compensate for these lacks of abilities. The brain is very complex, and if you're low in one thing, it usually tries to figure out a way to compensate or overcome it. But when we talk more about these specific abilities, it'll make some sense. But let me give you some example of some auditory processing problems. The human brain is naturally developed such that it can hear things and pay attention to specific sounds while ignoring others. A tape recorder does not have this ability. For instance, when you record something, the tape recorder is recording everything at the same level as it occurs in nature. Okay, if there's an air conditioning going, that air conditioner will be picked up by the cassette recorder. Now, our brains have the ability to ignore certain sounds and pay attention. Those that have this ability can pay attention to my voice and ignore the other sounds that are recorded on this cassette. The birds chirping outside, the refrigerator going, background noises, and just pay attention to my voice. Some children do not have that ability. They hear everything at the sound that it is given. And it's very hard for them to focus in on the teacher's voice and ignore the air conditioning or what's happening outside. Okay, that is an auditory processing problem. Some children have a different type of auditory processing problem, which allows them to hear 80% and process 80%. Now, these children may have perfect hearing. When they take a hearing test, they pass it. But they may only be able to process 80%. So that means they have to fill in the gaps for the other 20%. Now, unless you have special equipment, it's going to be very difficult to decide which child has an auditory processing problem. So many schools do not screen for auditory processing problems, and usually you have to go to a specific audiology department in a university or a professional audiology department in order to detect auditory processing problems. What a teacher will see is a child that cannot pay attention, that's not do well, and so they either label them attention deficit disorder, or it may be severe enough to cause a learning disorder, such as reading disorder, or a speech disorder. Okay, so that's just one of the many. There's probably hundreds of different abilities to look at. So we'll talk about how to screen for these and how to make the appropriate referral to get these things treated. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about two models that look at specific abilities that are related to learning problems. One is the neuropsychology model. There are two basic neuropsychology tests. We have the Halstead-Raytan test, and we have the Luria-Nebraska test for neuropsychology. What these tests are designed to do is look at specific abilities, cognitive abilities, and measure their strengths and weaknesses. The Halstead-Raytan test battery also comes with recommendations for how to remediate or rehabilitate the person of these skills. The problem with this model is that only neuropsychologists can give this test, and only neuropsychologists can provide the remediation for this test. Neuropsychologists usually charge a lot of money, and it's very impractical to send every child in for these tests and the remediation program. They're very expensive. Okay. Another program is the Structure of Intellect program. The Structure of Intellect is an intelligence test, and the only intelligence test that I know of that was based on a theory. All the other intelligence tests were not based on a theoretical model of intelligence. The SOI, or the Structure of Intellect model, was developed by Guilford, Peter Guilford. And from that was developed a test that will help children do better in school by measuring their abilities. It measures 26 abilities that are necessary for learning in school. Okay, so a good test then to measure cognitive abilities, or what's going inside the head, can be found in the Structure of Intellect. Now, many people have developed specific tests for auditory processing problems and for visual problems. The most common group that works with vision problems are developmental optometrists. They are not as common as regular optometrists. Regular optometrists measures 20/20 vision and some other abnormalities of the eyes. Their test usually takes about 20 minutes. You go to see the eye doctor, they measure you for lenses, and then you're out the door. A developmental optometrist will measure many problems that may be related to vision and have an impact on learning disorder. They will measure convergence. They will measure the eye's ability to track objects in space, an ability to focus far away and then close up. That's called focus flexibility. Let me give you an example. Some children can read okay. They may struggle with reading, but they can read okay and they can pass most reading tests. But when you give them board work, it takes them forever to do board work. And that's because when they look at the board, it takes their eyes a long time to focus on the board, and then they have to write on their paper, and it takes their eyes a long time to adjust so they can write down things on the paper. Then they have to look at the board. So whenever you see a child that can read okay, but when it comes to board work, take forever and their grades are falling because they're not doing the board work fast enough, then you may have a problem with developmental vision problems. So what a developmental optometrist will do is spend 1, 2,